When an empath finally reaches the point where forgiveness runs dry, something extraordinary begins to unfold. Carl Jung discovered that in this moment, every mask they have ever worn, and every mask worn by those around them, starts to fall away. Not just the masks of others, but the carefully constructed disguises the empath has built for themselves. Those who once appeared loving and gentle suddenly reveal their hidden manipulation. Relationships that seemed anchored in kindness begin to expose a deeper exploitation. And most devastating of all, the empath realizes that the heaviest mask they've carried was their own. The mask of endless forgiveness, a mask that was slowly draining the life from their soul. Can you picture that instant when illusion shatters? You forgive them again. The one who betrayed your trust, who confused your compassion with weakness, who treated your empathy as if it were an endless well they could return to without consequence. You force a smile. You say, "It's okay." You take their guilt onto your shoulders so they can sleep soundly, while you lie awake in the dark, questioning your own worth, wondering how much more you can endure. But this time, something shifts. The familiar relief of keeping the peace never arrives. Instead, a different current stirs within you. Rage. Not the wild, destructive fury that explodes outward, but the quiet, sacred rage of a soul that refuses to be silenced any longer. Jung described this as the collision with the shadow. That moment when everything you've suppressed, all the pain and resentment you've buried deep, suddenly rises and crashes into consciousness. For the empath, this collision is nothing short of transformational. But here lies Jung's profound discovery, one often overlooked. The empath's relentless forgiveness is not true compassion. It is something else entirely, what might be called survival forgiveness. A trauma response cleverly disguised as virtue, a coping mechanism born from fear. Jung encountered this pattern time and time again in his practice, noting how it carved itself into the lives of those who bore it. He once wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." The empath forgives not out of unshakable strength, but out of terror. Terror of abandonment, terror of conflict, terror of being judged as unkind or unworthy. From a young age, they learned that their value depended on their ability to absorb pain without protest, to sacrifice authenticity for the fragile reward of social acceptance. Jung called this the ultimate betrayal of the authentic self. Yet something revolutionary takes place when the empath decides to stop forgiving. The entire social structure, one that has long thrived on their quiet self-sacrifice, begins to collapse. And in that collapse, the masks begin to fall. First from others, then from the empath themselves. This is where Jung's most radical insight comes alive, in the recognition of the shadow. Shadow is everything we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves, the traits we exile and then project onto others. But for empaths, the shadow holds unexpected treasures, the untapped ability to embrace healthy selfishness, the power of righteous anger, and the sacred strength of boundaries. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." For empaths, this darkness is not evil, not some monstrous force to be feared. It is instead their long-suppressed instinct for self-preservation, the inner voice that recognizes exploitation, yet has been muted by the relentless need to appear good, kind, and endlessly forgiving. When empaths finally stop forgiving, They are not turning cruel, nor are they abandoning compassion. Rather, they are integrating the shadow, reclaiming those disowned parts of themselves that were sacrificed to sustain relationships never built on true reciprocity. Isn't it striking how what once seemed like virtue is revealed as self-erasure? Jung identified repeating patterns in highly sensitive people who begin reclaiming their psychological boundaries. These patterns form what can be seen as 8 signs of sacred rebellion. If you find echoes of these signs within yourself, you may be witnessing what Jung described as the birth of authentic selfhood. Sign 1. The energy stops leaking. This is what I call the energy reversal. Instead of absorbing the emotional waste of others as if it were your duty, you pause and ask, is this truly mine to carry? That simple question becomes a turning point. Jung observed that individuation, the journey toward wholeness, always begins with drawing a line between self and other. You start noticing how exhausted you feel after certain encounters. You begin distinguishing the difference between authentic remorse and manipulative guilt-tripping. Most importantly, you stop carrying the burden of regulating other people's emotions. Jung once wrote, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." And for the awakening empath, that moment of looking inward reveals the true cost of constant giving, a depleted, overlooked self waiting to be restored. Perhaps you too have reached the point where your intuition no longer whispers, but speaks with clarity. What happens next is remarkable. Others sense the change before you even name it. The energy drainers, the so-called vampires of attention and sympathy, begin to distance themselves because you are no longer feeding them. Sign 2, the performance ends. Jung referred to this as the death of the persona, the collapse of the carefully maintained social mask worn to gain acceptance. For empaths, this persona has always been the endlessly understanding one, the figure who tolerates and forgives no matter the cost. But once you stop automatic forgiveness, the mask becomes impossible to wear. You no longer say it's fine when it clearly is not. You stop making excuses for behavior that harms you. You refuse to perform emotional availability for those who never offered you the same in return. This is the end of emotional labor without reciprocity. Yet Jung warned that shedding the persona feels terrifying. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. To embody authenticity means facing the disappointment of those who only valued you for your performance. Sign 3. The manipulation becomes visible. And this is where Jung's deep understanding of projection becomes crucial. When empaths stop automatically forgiving, they step out of what I call the empathy exploitation cycle. This is the moment they begin noticing patterns of manipulation that once passed unnoticed, as if a veil has finally lifted. Suddenly you recognize love bombing for what it is. Exaggerated praise and overwhelming affection designed to extract quick forgiveness. You see guilt trips for what they truly are, not honest vulnerability, but subtle strategies to bend your will. You realize, perhaps with a mix of shock and clarity, that your deepest compassion was being weaponized against your own boundaries. Jung wrote, "Everything unconscious is projected." And the awakening empath finally stops projecting their own integrity onto others. They no longer assume that others share the same honesty or the same depth of care. Instead, they learn to see people as they are, not as they desperately hope they might become. Sign 4. The guilt loses its power. Jung observed that guilt is often nothing more than internalized shame. Shame placed upon us by those who benefit from our endless compliance. When empaths stop forgiving on reflex, they experience what can be called guilt immunity. They start to see guilt for what it really is, a control mechanism. Imagine the shift. No longer feeling guilty for setting standards, no longer apologizing for having clear boundaries. You begin to notice that anyone trying to guilt you back into forgiveness is simply revealing their dependency on your self-abandonment. Jung described this transformation as the integration of healthy selfishness, and he emphasized this is not cruelty, but the natural return of self-preservation that had been muted for far too long. Sign 5. The relationships sort themselves. Jung believed that authentic inner change always reshapes outer relationships. And when empaths stop forgiving indiscriminately, the process I call the great sorting begins. Bonds built on exploitation quietly dissolve. Authentic connections, by contrast, begin to deepen and strengthen. Of course, not everyone will remain. Some vanish the moment you stop serving as their emotional dumping ground. Others attempt to lure you back into old patterns of guilt and compliance. But a rare few respect your boundaries, rising to meet you with genuine reciprocity. Jung captured this truth beautifully. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But such transformation only happens when both individuals arrive authentically without masks or hidden agendas. Have you noticed how people begin treating you differently once you find your backbone? Many sense the shift even before you ever speak of it. Sign 6. The anger becomes sacred. Jung understood that anger, far from being destructive by nature, is often suppressed wisdom waiting to be heard. When empaths stop reflexive forgiveness, they gain access to what can be called sacred rage. This is not the chaos of blind fury, but the protective fire that finally declares no more. Suddenly, you feel anger about past violations you once minimized. You remember boundaries you never dared to set, and you feel the weight of that silence. This anger is not toxic, it is information, a clear signal from your psyche, pointing to the places where you abandoned yourself. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." And indeed, the pain of fully seeing how you've been treated becomes the fire that forges new, unshakable boundaries. Sign 7. The pattern recognition activates. Drawing on his work with psychological types, Jung noted that empaths often possess highly developed intuitive abilities. And when they stop forgiving automatically, this gift of intuition sharpens into overdrive. Patterns you once ignored become glaringly obvious. You start noticing the same manipulation tactics repeating across different people, as if the pattern had been there all along, but hidden in plain sight. You recognize the cycle transgression, a display of fake remorse, a sudden wave of love bombing, and then the inevitable repeat. This time, however, you see it for what it is. You begin spotting emotional predators before they fully reveal themselves, no longer blinded by the fog of misplaced trust. And this clarity is not paranoia. It is what Jung called differentiated consciousness, the ability to see without distortion, to observe reality without being consumed by emotional haze. Sign 8, the self emerges. This final sign marks what Jung described as the encounter with the self, not the fragile ego, not the carefully crafted persona, but the integrated wholeness of who you truly are beneath years of performance and suppression. When empaths stop forgiving reflexively, their authentic self finally begins to rise to the surface. You discover preferences you never even knew you had, because for so long you silenced them in order to accommodate others. You find your voice after years of swallowing silence. You come to realize that your needs, desires, and boundaries are not just valid, but vital, just as worthy of respect as anyone else's. If you recognize yourself in these patterns of transformation, you may also recognize this truth. My breaking point became my breakthrough. Jung expressed it simply. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And for the empath who stops forgiving, this privilege is finally claimed. Yet Jung never painted this journey in romantic tones. He warned that it passes through what he called the dark night of the soul, that difficult threshold where old patterns must die before something new can take their place. For empaths, this phase often feels like a kind of social death, since so much of their identity was constructed around being endlessly forgiving. You may lose friends who only valued your compliance. Family members may accuse you of becoming someone different, when in reality, you are becoming someone real. And yes, guilt often resurfaces. Guilt for setting boundaries you should have set long ago. Jung reminded us, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." For the empath, this descent means entering their own psychological underworld, confronting all the rage and pain they suppressed for years before they can rise toward authentic selfhood. And then when empaths stop forgiving automatically, something remarkable begins to unfold around them. What I call the great unmasking. The people who once hid behind the empath's endless understanding can no longer maintain their disguise. The narcissist can no longer use empathy as a shield against accountability. The manipulator can no longer twist compassion into compliance. The emotional vampire can no longer feed on the endless well of forgiveness. Your clarity forces them to reveal their true nature, whether they want to or not. Jung understood this deeply. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But he also warned that sometimes the irritation people feel toward you is not about their reflection at all. It is about your refusal to carry their shadow for them. And then comes the most shocking revelation of all, when the empath's own mask falls. They see, often with painful clarity, that their endless forgiveness was not pure selflessness. It was its own subtle form of manipulation, a way of preserving relationships through self-sacrifice rather than building connections rooted in authenticity. Jung called this the recognition of one's own shadow. For the empath, it is the startling realization that much of their forgiveness was not born of pure love, but quietly driven by fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, fear of being judged as unkind or bad. At first, this truth feels uncomfortable, even disorienting, but rather than shameful, it is profoundly liberating. Why? Because it means the empath can finally begin to love from a place of wholeness rather than from woundedness. To give, not because of compulsion, but because of genuine choice, that is the turning point. Jung carefully distinguished between unconscious and conscious psychological processes, and when empaths stop reflexive forgiveness, they begin to practice what I call conscious forgiveness. This kind of forgiveness does not arise instantly in the aftermath of wrongdoing. Instead, it arrives only after truth has been spoken, after boundaries have been clearly drawn, and after natural consequences have been allowed to unfold. It is forgiveness that includes justice, not forgiveness that bypasses it. Jung himself wrote, "Forgiveness is not the suppression of a justifiable reaction. True forgiveness honors the wound while releasing the grudge. It sees clearly while choosing not to be consumed by resentment." In this way, forgiveness becomes an act of clarity, not erasure. Jung also observed that psychological energy follows certain laws. When empaths stop leaking their energy through automatic forgiveness, that reclaimed power becomes available for something new, what I call creative self-expression. Imagine redirecting all that energy. Instead of endlessly absorbing the dramas of others, you finally have resources to pour into your own dreams, your own goals, and your own healing. You begin creating instead of consuming, investing your time and attention into pursuits you had abandoned to remain perpetually available for everyone else's crisis. You choose relationships that energize you rather than drain you. And this shift is not selfishness. Jung described it as individuation, the natural unfolding of a complete human being capable of giving to the world from a place of fullness rather than emptiness. For Jung, the transformation of the individual was never isolated. He believed that authentic personal growth contributes to collective change. When empaths stop forgiving automatically, they become living examples of a different way of being. What I call the authenticity virus begins to spread. Your courage to enforce boundaries gives silent permission for others to protect their own. Your refusal to enable dysfunction begins to reveal the fragile systems that depend on empathic compliance. And your authentic self-expression gently reminds everyone watching that they do not need to perform endlessly in order to be loved. And this is precisely why such transformation feels threatening to some. You are not merely changing yourself, you are rewriting the rules of engagement for everyone within your orbit. Jung's vision of individuation included not only the healing of the self, but also the capacity to form what he called conscious relationships, connections between two whole individuals rather than two wounded halves searching for completion. When empaths stop automatic forgiveness, they finally become available for this deeper level of connection. Instead of being drawn to those who exploit their openness, they begin to attract people who can meet their authenticity with authenticity of their own. Relationships are formed not out of mutual wounding, but out of mutual respect. Love begins to flow from a place of overflow rather than lack. And because these conscious relationships are rooted in honesty from the very beginning, they no longer demand constant forgiveness as maintenance. Conflicts, when they arise, are addressed immediately rather than suppressed until they eventually explode. This is what makes them healthier, more stable, more alive. Jung's process of individuation involves integrating every aspect of the psyche, the light and the shadow, the masculine and the feminine, the conscious and the unconscious. For empaths, this means learning to embrace both compassion and discernment, to balance tenderness with clarity. You learn to feel deeply without absorbing everything. You gain the strength to witness the pain of others without making it your personal responsibility. You become what I call compassionately detached, still caring, but no longer carrying. And this is what creates what Jung described as psychological wholeness. the ability to respond from the full spectrum of human capacity instead of reacting only from old, wounded empathic patterns. Jung also understood that true psychological development always carries a spiritual dimension. When empaths stop forgiving automatically, they often enter a stage I call sacred disillusionment. It feels painful, but it is necessary. The death of spiritual bypassing. You begin to see clearly that endless forgiveness was never spiritual evolution. It was, in fact, a form of spiritual stagnation. Authentic spiritual growth requires courage, the courage to face the shadow, to set boundaries, and to honor your own divine nature as much as the divine nature of others. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And that privilege includes becoming someone who forgives consciously, loves authentically, and serves not from depletion, but from wholeness." Jung was also among the first to recognize the intimate link between psychological and physical health. When empaths stop absorbing the emotions of everyone around them, their bodies often begin to heal from what I call energetic toxicity. Chronic fatigue starts to lift as you no longer process the emotional waste of others. Anxiety decreases when you are no longer hypervigilant, scanning every mood in the room. Even autoimmune issues can begin to improve once you stop unconsciously attacking your own boundaries. Your nervous system finally rests when it is no longer forced into constant activation by the dysregulation of others. This restoration is not miraculous. It is the body's natural response to the establishment of psychological boundaries. Jung observed that individuation ultimately leads to the development of wisdom, and empaths who learn the art of conscious forgiveness often step into the role of what I call wounded healers. They become individuals who can support and guide others without sacrificing themselves in the process. They can recognize empathic wounding in those they meet. But instead of being triggered or consumed by it, they now respond with clarity, balance, and strength. You can offer guidance without carrying the heavy burden of outcomes. You become like a lighthouse, steady, unshaken, radiating light across the darkness, yet never chasing ships that choose their own course. This kind of wisdom is not cold, nor does it mean detachment. It is warm but boundaried, caring yet not carrying, loving while never losing yourself. Jung believed that when an individual heals, that healing ripples outward into the collective. And when empaths learn the practice of conscious forgiveness, they do more than change their own lives. They disrupt and dismantle generational cycles of empathic exploitation. What I call the cycle breaker effect begins to take shape. You start modeling what healthy relationships look like for your children or for those who watch you closely. You refuse to play a role in family dysfunction, no matter how ingrained it may be. You demonstrate that empathy does not have to mean self-erasure, that sensitivity can live alongside strength. You become a living example that gentle souls can be both soft and unshakably strong. And this legacy doesn't stop with your immediate circle. Each boundary you set becomes silent permission for others to set theirs. Every time you choose conscious forgiveness over automatic forgiveness, you are quietly contributing to collective healing. Jung often spoke of paradoxes, knowing they revealed deeper truths. And the paradox of the empath's journey is profound. When you stop forgiving everyone else, you finally learn to forgive yourself. When you stop absorbing the weight of everyone's guilt, you begin to release your own shame. You forgive yourself for staying too long in toxic environments. You forgive yourself for betraying your own boundaries. You forgive yourself for confusing trauma bonds with love. This act of self-forgiveness is the deepest healing of all. Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And in that acceptance, the empath who once forgave others endlessly finally becomes able to forgive themselves. Not for being human, but for forgetting their own divine worth. So here is what I want you to truly understand. Your forgiveness is sacred. It is not meant to be handed out like sweets to anyone who demands it.
It is meant to be given consciously, when the soul is ready, when justice has been honored, when truth has been spoken. Jung devoted his life to studying what it means to become whole, and he discovered that this wholeness always requires the courage to say no to what diminishes you, so you can say yes to what strengthens and honors you. If you recognize yourself in these 8 signs, then you are already walking the very path Jung mapped out. Trust the process, trust your anger, trust your boundaries, trust the unfolding of your authentic self. Becoming who you truly are is not selfish, it is necessary.
Refusing to forgive automatically does not harden you, it makes you real. And in a world of illusions, masks, and performance, nothing is more needed than real empaths, people who choose to love from fullness, to serve from freedom, and to forgive from wisdom. Because when an empath stops forgiving, every mask falls away. The masks others wore to manipulate your kindness, the masks you wore to shield yourself from their anger. And in that sacred stripping away, something luminous emerges, your authentic self. The self that no longer strives for perfection in order to be worthy. The self that finally knows beyond doubt. You do not need to be perfect to be loved. You don't need to be endlessly understanding in order to be valuable. You don't need to carry the weight of everyone's pain just to prove your worth. Jung's greatest gift to empaths is this very recognition, the path of individuation. Becoming who you truly are is not only your right, it is also your responsibility. Responsibility not just to yourself, but to a world in desperate need of conscious empaths, of healers with boundaries, and of people who can love from a place of wholeness rather than woundedness. Because isn't that the truth? A love born of wholeness heals, while a love born of wounds only repeats cycles. Individuation calls the empath to rise into authenticity, no longer defined by what they can tolerate, but by who they truly are. If you want to dive deeper into the empath's journey toward psychological sovereignty, explore what happens when the empath finally stops pleasing everyone and begins seeing reality for what it is. In that exploration lies the complete transformation, from endless people-pleasing to authentic empowerment, from silent compliance to courageous truth-telling. This journey, moving from automatic forgiveness to conscious choice, is not just an act of personal healing.
It is something far greater. It is revolutionary. And Jung would be proud. He would see in this evolution the living embodiment of his teachings, the courage to face the shadow, the discipline to set boundaries, and the wisdom to embrace authentic selfhood. So thank you for walking this path, for listening, for daring to step beyond the roles you were given. See you in the next dimension.